It's hard to believe, but it's been 40 years since Marvel launched one of the biggest events in comic books in the 1980s, and that's Secret Wars. This past year, I spent some time to revisit the series, and while, time hasn't been kind to this series, the nostalgia factor is certainly off the charts. The basic premise of Secret Wars is you have this being from another dimension with vast powers, and what he does is he basically kidnaps all of Earth's mightiest superheroes and supervillains, and he brings them to this one place where they would fight, and the victors would get all that they desire. And that's basically the premise, and this story would be spread out in 12 issues. So in this video, I'm going to go over my top 10 most memorable moments in Secret Wars. I should note that this list is not in chronological order. The events take place in various different issues. And as a warning, there are a lot of spoilers in this series. If you haven't read the series, then it's certainly worth taking a look at just because of the significance of the event. And if it's been a while, I would suggest to revisit it because there are a lot of fun moments in this series. Okay, let's jump right in. The top 10 most memorable moments in Secret Wars. So Spider-Man versus Titania. Now, as a young reader back then, what I really liked about comic books was when there were a lot of good battles. And certainly in this series, there are a tremendous number of battles that are memorable. This one in particular, I'm putting at number 10 because it's kind of this classic David versus Goliath where you have Spider-Man versus Titania. And Titania was created by Doctor Doom earlier in the series in issue number 4. And the reason why was he kind of wanted to even up the odds with regards to the superheroes versus the supervillains. So he takes two people and he creates Volcana and Titania. And she would prove to be a force to be reckoned with throughout the series. But in issue number 8, despite all her strength, she gets beaten pretty handily by Spider-Man. And the sequence is great, with classic quips by Spider-Man doing what he does best, which is trash-talking his opponent while beating them. This reminds me a lot of Spider-Man number 20, the classic issue that has the first appearance of Scorpion. In that story, it's much of the same. It's a classic battle between Spider-Man and a much stronger opponent, where he uses his smarts and agility to defeat them. Again, the classic story of David versus Goliath. So number 9 is when Doctor Doom kills Kang. At this point in 1984, my comic knowledge wasn't really that good. And I didn't know much about Kang. All I knew was that he was, a bad guy and he appeared in a lot of Avengers issues. But that's about it. And unfortunately, I wouldn't get to know much more about him because in issue number 4, Doctor Doom uses Ultron to dispatch Kang pretty quickly. Kang just has this kind of bad luck of never being able to stick around to amount to anything. Am I right? At this point, the story is certainly cementing itself to be more of a Doctor Doom versus everybody instead of superheroes versus the supervillains. And why not? Doctor Doom is such a great and deep character. He can certainly handle it. Jim Shooter recounts in his blog that the main driver of this series were two things. A lot of fans have always kind of wanted to have this huge event where you have the superheroes battle supervillain. And, they got a small taste of it with Contest of Champions, a few years before that. But that only really had superheroes and the superheroes fighting each other, not superheroes versus supervillains. So you had a lot of fans wanting to have this kind of, dream kind of series with superheroes and supervillains. As well, you had Mattel kind of pitch to Marvel that they wanted to create a toy line. And so with Mattel and with, the interest of fans, Jim Shooter thought, okay, this is the time to do it. This would be a great series to have, Secret Wars where you have all these superheroes fight all these supervillains. When, word got out that, Marvel was, creating this series where you have all these superheroes and supervillains, a lot of fans got really excited. As I mentioned previously, a lot of the story is about Doctor Doom, and specifically his scheming. He's always up to tricks, and in issue number 7, he's on Galactus's home base, essentially being a burglar or a thief, looking for any technology to give him an edge. There's a hilarious short sequence of events when he's there, wondering if he's going to get caught, and inevitably he does, and Galactus swats him away like an insect. This wouldn't be the first time Doctor Doom gets a beating in this series, and it certainly wouldn't be the last, but I just really enjoyed this sequence of events. So Wolverine versus Absorbing Man. Okay, so, in a lot of ways, as the saying goes, Wolverine just got done dirty in Secret Wars. He was, on the most part, highly ineffectual. But there's this one scene where he fights the Absorbing Man, and it's a really short sequence. This also happened in issue number 7, which is a great battle issue. The Absorbing Man is what you would call an A-level supervillain. Here's a guy who took on the entire Avengers and commonly went head-to-head against Thor. In one panel, Wolverine chops off the arm of the Absorbing Man in a very one-sided fight. As a big fan of Wolverine at that time, it was just nice to see Wolverine kind of get his chops in. And don't worry, Absorbing Man fans, Crusher Creel is made of sturdy stuff, and he's able to reattach his arm later in that issue. Okay, new costume for Spider-Man in issue number 8. Okay, wait a minute, why isn't this higher on the list? How could the most important event, arguably, not be higher, not be number 1 instead of number 6? Well, to be honest, it's just not a memorable event. Remember, this list ranks the most memorable moments for me, not the most important, and the actual new costume would be revealed several months before in Amazing Spider-Man number 252, about the same time the first issue of Secret Wars came out. The origin of the new costume wouldn't be revealed, though, until issue number 8 of Secret Wars. And the buzz and excitement of Spider-Man's new costume was certainly there at this time. But the origin itself is really not very interesting. Spider-Man essentially got his costume from a machine, a different machine that the other superheroes used, so there was, some mystery there. And the reveal of the costume was pretty cool, but the origin itself, kind of boring. But I get it. How on earth do you make the origin of a costume interesting? Does anyone remember an interesting story about the origin of a costume? Let me know in the comments below. This open-endedness of the origin did allow writers a wider number of possibilities, and in the future, this would be very significant. Marvel would kind of receive a lot of grief about the costume, and that's understandable because, people really like Spider-Man. And, in some ways, the costume would come in and out of fashion, and it would also have a memorable end in Web of Spider-Man number 1. But as you know in comic books, very few things stay dead. The symbiote would come back, with a vengeance. Some guy, I think his name is Venom or something. Number 5 is Spider-Man beats the X-Men. I feel like over the years, Jim Shooter just kind of had a bit of a hate on the X-Men. Or, maybe he thought the X-Men were a bit kind of overrated. And certainly in this series, there are a few moments where the X-Men are taken down a notch. And this happens in issue number 3, where Spider-Man single-handedly beats the X-Men over a couple pages when he finds out they're going to join forces with Magneto. And it's a pretty significant beating. I mentioned earlier that they did Wolverine dirty in this series, and nothing is dirtier than Spider-Man swatting him away like a fly. If there's another X-Men that absolutely got no spotlight in this series, it's also Nightcrawler. Colossus got his soap opera love story, Storm got her, team leadership question, Cyclops showed up here and there, along with Rogue. But Nightcrawler was NAF, not a factor. What's more memorable than Spider-Man beating the X-Men? Well, that would be the Wasp beating the X-Men. And that happened in issue number 4. Yes, in issue number 4, the Wasp takes the X-Men to town as well. And this also includes Magneto at this time. As I mentioned, it's kind of interesting to see Shooter take the X-Men down a notch in this series, and the Wasp is about as bad as it gets. I can only think that maybe Hawkeye would be worse, but he was just too busy making arrows all the time. As memorable as this is, the Wasp would also get killed in issue number 6. And this was a shocker as well, because you just didn't see characters get killed that often, even if they're not popular characters like the Wasp and her infinite costumes. But, fear not, readers, Wasp would be restored in a later issue. I want to talk about how big this series was in 1984. So, with regards to sales, Secret Wars was the best-selling title every month for the entire year. Capital Comics at that time reported that one of the issues had direct sales of 250,000 copies, which is a substantial amount at that time. And remember, this is also not including newsstand sales. And while newsstand sales were certainly in the decline at that time, they still made a pretty healthy chunk of the sales, certainly above 100,000 copies. So, this was a big success for Marvel, and ultimately, they would try to copy this, as well as other publishers like DC with their own kind of mega event like Superpowers and then Crisis on the Infinite Earth. That being said, comic books still have to be good. They have to be entertaining. And while Marvel tried to kind of duplicate the success of Secret Wars with Secret Wars 2, Secret Wars 2 ended up kind of falling flat. Okay, number 3 on the list. In issue number 4, something spectacular happens. In issue 4, there's a sequence where Molecule Man literally decides to drop a mountain range on top of his heroes just to show off to his new girlfriend. The Hulk holds it back, but time is running out. And here you have Reed Richards shine as he makes the Hulk angry so that the Hulk can hold the mountain back while he formulates a plan to get them out. I just love this sequence as it shows off Reed Richards' smarts in a tough situation. I think I remember reading somewhere as well that one of the reasons why Reed Richards is so smart is not only is he able to stretch his limbs, but as well he's able to stretch his brain. Easily one of the most memorable moments in Secret Wars for me. Coming in number 2, and this is not a specific event, but just a combination of events, and that would be the absolute mess. That would be issue number 12 of Secret Wars, the last issue. And a lot of comic book fans would kind of complain about, how this series ended. And rightly so. It just was a mess. It was kind of hard to understand, and it just kind of fell flat. I think at this time, Jim Shooter was just kind of running out of gas, and with all the different stuff he had to tie up, a lot of the stuff didn't necessarily make sense, or just felt kind of weak. I remember at that time trying to read and figure out what was going on, and to be honest, I couldn't. Trying to untangle what had happened in the previous 11 issues, really must have been a daunting task. It just didn't feel like a clean, satisfying ending to all that had happened in this series. As a whole, Secret Wars was a huge success and had a lot of memorable moments, but I think a lot of comic book fans just kind of shook their heads at issue number 12. In what could have been a truly classic series, it just kind of ended with this kind of confusing, dull thud. And coming in at number 1 for me, the most memorable moment would be Doctor Doom beating the Beyonder in issue number 10. Now, issue number 10 has a spectacular Doctor Doom cover by Mike Zeck. And, in this issue, the fight between Doom and the Beyonder really is amazing. But that being said, the Doctor Doom battle with the Beyonder for the longest time was a mystifier for me. You have to remember, as a middle school student reading this series at that time, it was not easy for me to pick up on everything. And for the longest time, I really didn't or couldn't quite understand how Doom was able to defeat the Beyonder. Maybe there were other people who didn't get it as well at that time. I remember having this conversation with my other comic book friends at that time, and, we couldn't quite get it as well. Just how did Doom beat the Beyonder? Doom, with his technical smarts, was able to devise a machine that would siphon all of the power of Galactus, and he was able to do it successfully. He would then create a sling, so to speak, to take down Goliath, which he kind of monologues about in the later panels, and he puts it in the breastplate of his armor. And I think I had a tendency to kind of gloss over Doom's monologues, and he monologues a lot, so I think I must have missed this detail. Anyway, now that he has the power of Galactus, he takes on the Beyonder head-on. And previously, the Beyonder just kind of swatted Galactus away, but this time, Beyonder does something differently. He completely takes Doom apart and, literally decides to dissect him. And here we see Doom somehow regaining consciousness and reaching for his armor. And the next thing you know, Shazam, he's got all the powers of the Beyonder. Doom is one crafty guy, but it just seemed way too easy for him to defeat the Beyonder. I wish they could have showed a little bit more just how this transfer of power happened, because for the longest time I didn't get it. Not that the beating would prove anything, because like every other bad guy that reaches omnipotence, They fall asleep or have this tiny moment of doubt and everything just comes crashing down on them. So there you go. The top 10 most memorable moments of Secret Wars. 40 years ago, a great nostalgic series from Marvel that had a lot of comic book fans talking, whether good or bad. I'm sure there are other moments that I probably missed, or other moments that other readers found to be more memorable. If there are any in particular, please let me know in the comments below. I'd love to get some feedback on what other people thought about this series. If you enjoyed this retrospective, I did one on the Fantastic Four, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby's memorable 102 issue run that you can check out over here. Until next time, read and enjoy your comic books.